The Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, located in San Francisco, was originally built in 1870, located on 638 acres of waterfront. In the mid-1950s, the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard employed over 8,500 civilians. Racism was a big problem that sparked Hunters Point as well as the South. African Americans escaped the South looking for new life, but instead racism followed most of them to Hunters Point, causing several problems for themselves and their families. The Navy eventually took over 11 days before Pearl Harbor. Between 1941 and 1974, the facility was focused on its main point, shipbuilding. This was the start of World War II. The shipyards was used for repairing facilities. Shipbuilding was the primary purpose of the docks. The abandoned buildings on the base were turned into studios, workshops, and small businesses from the barracks in 1974. Hunters Point was a useful place during the war, for it was there when things needed repairing and protected us against enemies trying to attack. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Navy took the entire shipyard. In 1945, over 18,000 workers were working at the base. During World War II, Hunters Point Naval Shipyards built and overhauled warships, concentrating afterward on submarine testing and repair. The World War II was at its peak and quickly became the dominant force in the Hunters Point neighborhood. The shipyard was needed to serve the national wartime effort. Its initial development took shape in a whirlwind effort to build the shipyard as quickly as possible. After the Navy purchased the shipyards, they immediately began to expand its facilities by 1945. In 1945, the atomic bomb known as Little Boy was shipped from Hunters Point and dropped to Japan, ending World War II. Hunters Point became home to several Chinese fishermen who caught shrimp and sold them in stores. In 1930, a dozen of shrimp camps speckled the Hunters Point shoreline by the clusters of offices, homes, and warehouses. Many of the residents in Hunters Point that weren't a part of working in the maritime used the abandoned land to grow vegetables to sell in San Francisco inner city. Recruiting to the shipyards was the primary focus. The Navy needed men to work and men needed money to provide for their families. The end of 1944, the Navy brought 1,000 new workers to Hunters Point every month. The recruiters mainly targeted African American men and their families. They migrated from the South to San Francisco. They recruited men by driving wagons through southern neighborhoods and offered free transportation to the South. Men and women in the Southern were getting away from the overt racism and racial violence that plagued the South. Many moved to San Francisco hoping to find more work opportunities and finding racial equality. By 3 years after initial recruiting, the number of African American families in Hunters Point grew tremendously, increasing from 2,000 to 12,000. By 1950, the total population then reached up to 51,406. Out of these people, the shipyards employed 17,714 civilians. Life on the shipyard during World War II. The shipyards created plentiful work opportunities and lively living environment. Along the edges of the shipyard, the Navy built several housing for the workers and their families. The Navy provided medical services, extensive social and domestic facilities. Workers had access to the cafeteria, personal training school, commissionary store, recreational facilities, and bus terminal. The Navy enlisted almost a third of its residents' population. The shipyard had a friendly and lively neighborhood. Between bowling leagues, Shipyard Girl of the Month, and safety work challenges, the base had everything you would never have to leave the yard for anything. There were enough jobs and the Navy provided enough basic services to all Hunters Point residents, white or black, to live comfortable lives during times when everyone was expected to sacrifice for the wartime effort. All these people came together to serve their country. Both whites and African Americans lived and worked in the shipyard, both to serve their country. However, it is unclear to what extent these amenities were extended to African American workers and whether African Americans in Hunters Point had the same wartime experience and quality of life as whites. Most African Americans at the time have experienced racial discrimination and injustice. However, there aren't much publications of this material. Racial issues and prejudice were a large component of the Hunters Point wartime experience. At the Hunters Point Naval Shipyards, black and whites did live in separate barracks until housing segregation became illegal in 1954. During World War II, the shipyard employees rowed boats to serve their country and make the Hunters Point neighborhood an enjoyable place to live. By the 1960s, Hunters Point became increasingly segregated from San Francisco and were composed predominantly of African Americans and other racial minorities. This decline of infrastructure, limited employment, and racial discrimination were notable problems. In 1966, racial tensions sparked a race riot at Hunters Point. When the war was over, many whites fled the shipyard with their families. They had the resources to relocate. However, many African Americans were still experiencing racial discrimination and financial problems, which kept them restricted to the Hunters Point neighborhood. Many had relocated from the South and had to come to Hunters Point for a fresh start. Housing discrimination at that time was very strong and provided a very real barrier for blacks that wanted to move into other areas of San Francisco. Most people who left Hunters Point after 1955 were white. The shipyard workers at Hunters Point had built their lives around the war. Both blacks and whites moved across the country, leaving family and friends behind. In order to fill national wartime labor needs, the end of the war for many shipyard workers meant the end of a lifestyle. African Americans coming from the South dealt with several situations of racial discrimination. When starting a new life at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyards, they hoped they escaped this racial content. However, that was not the case. Racism followed many African Americans throughout the shipyards. They weren't given the same respect and opportunities as many white folks were. The primary reason for Hunters Point being 76% black community at the time was because many white people were able to relocate their families to better neighborhoods in the South.